Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to a NaijaMan's perspective. Today in the studio, I have Yomi Obisesan, who is an IT professional and a pan-africanist. Yomi, how you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing very well. How about yourself?
Yeah, not bad at all. Not bad at all. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll just get straight into today?
Yeah, sure. But before I do that, I think first of all, I have to say I'm a big fan of your channel. I've been following it since the moment you started it, and I think your contents are great. Your ability to blend world affairs with entertainment. I think especially was it last year, the protest in Nigeria, when you were able to give a close-up perspective of what was going on. So a lot of credit to you, and you're doing amazing things. So just thought I get that out of the way first of all. Regarding to myself, IT professional, so I work in the private sector. Um, but I'm an avid pan-africanist. I look at world affairs through the lens of how that impacts Africa. Within my sphere of influence, what I try and do is make sure that the people around me, specifically those with African background, empower them with knowledge. Those who wish to change their careers as well in various areas like data, IT, trying to empower them with that knowledge. And I think also is give brothers and sisters out there the opportunity to really understand what's going on around the world, what that means for them, what that means for Africa. So that's one thing that I try and do on a regular basis. It's something that I have a lot of passion for.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the kind words that you said earlier. Thinking we start with Africa first, and then we can go to other matters. But a lot is happening. A lot has been happening over the last 1 year in terms of geopolitics, infrastructure, in terms of Africa trying to gain its own way in the world, in this capitalist world. What is your take about Africa in general? Obviously, Africa has 54 countries,
Yes.
but at the same time, it will always be looked at as a continent, even though there are individual countries there with their own viewpoints, their own ideologies, and their own political systems. But Africa is seen as a unit, whether we like it or not. What's your view about what's going on? Because you touched on a few things earlier when you talked about helping brothers and sisters in terms of they want to change career, but also I saw a little bit of identity in your words when you were introducing yourself, and you're obviously proud to be an African. And what does it mean to be an African in 2025? But over to you.
Yeah, that's it's a very good question. I think Africa is going through a real transformation. In a way, it's almost like a clash of two ends. On one end, there's a generation that is really trying to get out of the old narrative of Africa being a country stricken with poverty on the very low side of the supply of the global supply chain. So there's that one side trying to come out of that, and through liberation and a lot of action. And we see Burkina Faso, for example, and Mali as one side of the spectrum. There's then the other side, which is around those who perhaps still enjoy the status quo. And that's probably because the status quo is beneficial to them, right? You see, for example, the past president in Ghana, there were a number of things and allegations made with regards to corruption. We look at what's happening in Kenya. While some good things are happening in Kenya, some things that are not so great, like we're hearing about the protests and so on happening there. We also, can't talk about Africa without talking about Nigeria. We see, to some extent, some things that are trying to be in a good way, but at the same time, there's still a lot that still needs to be done. Our leaders, to some extent, they can be quite disappointing in the way they behave. So I think it's a clash of a number of things. So, but for me, what I see as an African in 2025 is to be part of a movement part of a wave which is coming out of the old narrative and trying to create a new narrative, right? The world is definitely changing. We live in a world whereby, due to social media, the democratization of knowledge, a lot of people are really starting to understand what it means to be an African, and then trying to, through their behaviors, through their agitation for liberation, and other ways as well. For example, like I mentioned in the introduction, your sphere of influence. What are you doing to your, brother or sister or your relative around, around your sphere of influence, trying to do things that are bringing positive change towards Africa. So I think it's a number of things, but still a long way to go.
Yeah, definitely still a long way to go. It's, talking about Africa, we can look at it from different lenses. I talked about geopolitics earlier. We can look at it from the perspective of unity. We can also look at it from the perspective of removing ourselves from the shackles of the past, like you said. We can also look at it from capitalism in terms of, improving GDPs and GNPs. That's gross domestic product and gross national product, for anyone who's watching and doesn't know what those terms are. What do you think is the biggest? Because sometimes you see in life, when you try and tackle so many problems at the same time, you end up tackling none. So you have to have what I call a prioritization list. What is your priority? What are you looking to tackle? So with your enthusiasm and your deep knowledge of African affairs, which I know you have, because you're always constantly, putting yourself in the thick of the information out there, and that's the only way you can engage and influence your sphere. You have to know what's going on. So what do you think are the major issues right now? And what do you think would be those quick wins that can take Africa from where it is to where it needs to be?
Yeah, thanks for that. So I think the very first thing is an understanding of what it means to be an African and to be proud of being an African. So you and I know this very well, whereby because of the historical context around Africa and some of the news items we hear, over the last 40 years or thereabout, typically looking at an African, there tends to be some negative connotations there, right? Even for us Africans, sometimes that can be a problem. But I think that narrative needs to change. That's the first thing. The first thing for the liberation of the African continent is through the mind. One has to look at yourself in a positive way as an African. And how do you do that? By understanding not just the history that some other people wish to tell about the continent, but actually having a deeper understanding of the African history. We have such a rich history, whether it's from the southern part, eastern part, and western part, and so on. We look at, Mali, for example. Mansa Musa was once the richest man in the world. So this was the person who was the king of the Mali Empire back then. We look at the Benin Empire. It's rich in its artistry, in knowledge and technology, in medicine and science. We look at Timbuktu, for example, also in the Malian side, where this was the citadel of knowledge. Some history even tells us that Greek civilization was based off civilization learned in Timbuktu. So it's by having that knowledge of what the true historical context of Africa is, that will start to change the way we see ourselves. So I think that's the first thing. And this is also at a whole continental scale. It's not just at an individual. I think that comes all the way from the top. So for me, that's the first thing. The second thing is around unity. So one of the things that is a challenge for Africa is unity. Yes, we have the African Union, but we know that the African Union is plagued by its own internal problems. And that's because, you mentioned it earlier, 55 countries are trying to have a unified strategy. But if you have divisions within your own individual states, it's very difficult to have unity at the continental state. But that is very crucial. You know, I think Africa needs a unified strategy of how it will tackle world affairs, how it interacts with the rest of the world, and then start prioritizing and actually sounding with one voice. I think that's the second bit. And obviously, we're just glossing over this. I'm more than happy to go into this in more detail. And I think the third thing is around a re-engineering of the African economy. So if we look at technology, for example, so I'm a technology enthusiast, right? All the things that power AI, that power machine learning, these are all based off raw materials that are obtained in Africa. So the Congo, for example, is you have cobalt and coltan. These are all the raw materials that power the technology of today and of the future. So historically, Africa has been at the bottom of the supply chain, where we provide the raw materials. These raw materials are then taken overseas. They're then transformed into final products and then sold back to us at high prices. Now, I think that narrative has to change. If you have the raw materials and if you have the know-how of how to make the finished products, then you're strategically well positioned to start producing these things for yourself. I mean, let's take a very simple example, the most basic example, right? So we all love Belgian chocolates, right? It's one of the best in the world. But the cocoa comes from Ghana, right? So why can't the Ghanaians start to make their own chocolates and sell it to all the 55 countries? So I think redesigning your economy and not being part of the supply chain, but actually getting yourself into being a manufacturing base is important for you to then be able to redefine the future and be able to write your destiny. So for me, I think I see those as the three priorities. The mind, first of all, unity, and then sorting out the economics of how you actually convert yourself from a supplier of raw materials to actually a producer of manufacturing goods.
Excellent. I mean, you touched on a lot of things there about how, I think if you look at the supply chain, if you look at the supply chain map, the people that manufacture, that have the raw materials tend to make the least. And those that now have the finished goods tend to export it back to those who had the original products. And you touched on cobalt, you touched on, I think you were talking about rare earth minerals, which the Congo and other countries in Africa have rich supply in. And with us going into the AI world, it's going to be powered by electricity. A lot of it is going to be powered by electricity, as we're already seeing with the electric cars, electric bikes, almost everything's electric these days. Wristwatches, phones have been, and those materials in these products, a lot of them are in Africa. There's evidence of a huge deposit of cobalt and on all these things, even in Nigeria and Zamfara and some other parts of Nigeria. There are high deposits. Why there's a lot of mining going on in Nigeria at the moment. So what you're saying sort of like hits the nail. And I like the way you've also touched on, the mind is the first thing. And then you now went into how we can get unified. You see, so for me, there are historical, political, and, economic and maybe cultural reasons why this is how it is. So we've had the colonial legacy about how Africa was carved up by the European powers during the 1884 Berlin Conference, which still impacts till today because of the artificial borders that they created, which divided ethnic groups and lumped unrelated ones together, which led to internal conflicts and a lack of national cohesion. So even though independence sort of like moved away from those, or seemingly moved away from those artificial borders, right? Even after independence, many African countries inherited those divisions and remained inward focused rather than united. And I'm even talking about in the country itself. I'm not even talking about Africa being united as one bloc. And then you have an issue where you have, there has been rivalries between countries, and also some political elites see unity as a threat to their personal or national power due to their interests. How do you think we can move away with these three things that you mentioned and use some of those challenges and turn them into opportunities for the future? I think education is a way to go, but I'm really interested to hear what your thoughts are on how those three things you mentioned can be turned around for the greater good.
So, I mean, yeah, thanks for that. So I think ultimately there's always going to be diversity. I mean, if we look numerically, everything starts from number one, and then from number one, it's the author of diversity. So we should embrace that diversity, that differences in culture and lifestyle. But at the same time, we should be able to find a common denominator that we agree on. Let's look at an example. So in Europe, they fought 2 wars, and that was as a result of various disagreements or one kind of conflict or the other. But then at the end, they found something that they had to be unified on. First, let's stop any kind of significant war like we saw in the 20th century. And then there was a need for Europe that had already been decimated through the wars to then improve their economies. And that led to not just the United Nations, obviously that's at a global level, but a number of European institutions were created, which eventually led to the EU and what we call today the Eurozone. So we had the European Economic Area, right? So what the Europeans essentially did was they said, yes, we are different in certain ways. We have our diversity, but we will find some kind of common ground. And I think that's essentially what Africa needs to do, right? Okay. So we may have borders, but at the same time, we should be able to reach a common goal. And that common goal is, how can we move from our current state to a more sustainable future, right? The next thing I feel that is also needed is a way of harmonizing the movement of capital and movement of labor.
Okay.
So right now, if you want to travel from, say, Nigeria to South Africa, you probably need a visa and so on. Now, if you happen to be a professional in a particular field that there's a demand for it in South Africa, you'd have to go through the immigration process in order to get to South Africa. Now, I think, and this is my modest opinion, that if you harmonize the movement of human capital, you harmonize the movement of financial capital, then a lot of things can actually work. No longer should you see yourself as a South African or as a Nigerian, but you see yourself as an African. And therefore you're saying, if there is a need for something in a particular country, my brother or my sister on this other side of the continent, I'm more than happy for them to arrive and do the job. And Rwanda is doing something like that to some extent, whereby they've essentially opened up their borders and they're saying, we invite our African brothers and African sisters, come in, and if you have something that would transform and improve our economy, by all means, do that. So if one country can do that, and we know Rwanda is doing quite well, obviously they have their own problem, but overall they're doing quite well. So if one country can do that, now imagine 55 countries doing that. I think those are the key things whereby, despite the conflicts, despite the diversity, find some kind of common ground, and at the same time harmonize the movement of financial capital as well as human capital.
Yeah, thank you very much. So just following up on that, and I like how you mentioned Rwanda. Kagame has been doing a good job. He has his critics, but who doesn't? But if you follow the money and you follow tourism and the influx of people going to Rwanda for, for tourism, whether they're going to see the reserves or they're going to, or even the reputation of it being the cleanest city in Africa. Whether you believe it or not, they have the perception. Having that perception alone, triggers people to say, okay, why do I need to go to Germany? Why do I need to go to Spain? Why not Rwanda? As a family holiday. It didn't hurt them that they also had I think Visit Rwanda or something like that on Arsenal's jersey.
That's correct.
Which obviously, as long as a global football club and playing in a global sport, and that is seen by millions of people, if not billions of people, things like that also help. But my question is this: what do you think African governments, schools, or influencers should be doing differently to empower African pride in young people?
That's a great question. So an influencer, by definition, they're able to reach out to multiple people and disseminate information. So if we look at Nollywood, and we're proud for our Nollywood movies, I'm a big fan of it. But I think some of the content of those movies should be used in such a way whereby they're promoting Nigeria or promoting Africa. Maybe this is a not so great example, but I'll still use it anyway. So if you watch a movie and they're talking about some business deal or whatever, they tend to denominate it in dollars, right? Because I guess it's a fancy thing to do in the context of the movie. This billionaire is trying to close this deal and so on in dollars. But in Nigeria, you do not spend US dollars. You spend Nigerian naira. So I think that very simple thing whereby you are able to give the context of what you're doing within the context of your financial system. Because the moment you introduce dollar into the conversation, you're actually talking about a foreign financial system. So just that alone should be, I think it's a way to essentially change the narrative, right? So that's one example. I think also we have, our content creators have done an amazing job, just like yourself, for example, where, disseminating information. Now, this platform that we're on right now, it will be watched by loads of people. And it's a way for people to gain some kind of perspective and empower them with knowledge. I think a lot of the influencers and entertainment industry should do the same thing as well. Some of them do that to some extent. Look at Davido, for example. I think he has an ability to integrate different flavors of African music into his songs, and he does that quite well. And I think more of that should happen. So within your sphere of influence, try and find a way of integrating other aspects of what your African brothers and African sisters are doing to educate and elevate the audience, or at least the audience within the context of what you're doing.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. If you're new to my channel, please subscribe, follow, like, and share to as many people as possible. My next question is, if you had the power to change one thing that would move Africa forward tomorrow, what would that thing be?
So that's a difficult one, but I think one thing is the love of one to the other. So if we look at our African leaders, you vote your African leader into office, and a lot of them tend to look at that position as a position of privilege and as a position to essentially subjugate or oppress the masses of people. But if you look at that position as a position of service, that you've been elected to serve, and you have the passion or to not just lead, but lead by example, then that would go a long way. If we go back to those who were agitating for independence, Kwame Nkrumah, Nnamdi Azikiwe, Osajie, those kind of people, you saw that they had this undying love, not just for their people, but for Africa as a whole. And they were willing to fight, and to some extent, even unfortunately be killed for the love that they had for their country. And I think Africa is lacking leaders such as that right now. You know, if we look at Nigeria as an example, I think a lot of those who are in power tend to see that as a position of privilege. And they use that to then enrich themselves. But if you had the love for your people, if you had the love for your continent, you had the love for your country, you would sacrifice for your country. You would do away with whatever privileges you think you are entitled to and actually do the job, right? So I think if there was one thing, is if there was a way to, in a way, press a remote button and, you know, switch, is to be able to create those true Pan-Africanist leaders like we had in the past, those who are more interested in transforming their country as opposed to transforming their pockets. That's, for me, I think is a very, very big thing.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you so much for sharing your insights today. It's clear the question of what it means to be African isn't just about geography or culture, but also about a deeper sense of connection, pride, and progress. Your thoughts have really sparked some powerful reflections, and I'm sure our viewers will take a lot from this conversation. Just before I wrap up, if there's a piece of advice you can give Africans both on the continent and in diaspora on how they can contribute to the ongoing evolution of our identity, what would it be?
I think, first of all, I would say be proud of your African heritage. Carry it with pride wherever you go. I would say always make sure that you're promoting excellence in whatever you're doing, whatever profession you're doing. Always promote that excellence. Understand your history. Understand where you're coming from. Our history did not necessarily start with slavery. Our history goes way back further than that. And it's a rich history. It's a great history. It's one that is covered with so much glory. There's so much success story there. Yes, the enslavement of Africans happened, but it was just a pause to our history. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way. Obviously, there's a real deep thing that happened over there. But I think in terms of the richness of our history, it was just a pause to, the true history of the continent. I think other things I would say is, for those who desire for a better future for Africa, continue to do what you're doing. If you feel that you can use your platform to educate people, to enlighten people, continue to do that. If you feel that you are more comfortable to go out and, protest peacefully, obviously, to express a grievance, continue to do that. And I would say invest in the continent as well. So if you're in the diaspora, invest in the continent. If your investments are abroad, then it's all concentrated abroad. But if you're able to diversify into the continent, you're contributing one way or the other into the upliftment, the evolution, and the growth of the continent.
Absolutely, absolutely. And once again, thank you so much for your time and wisdom. It's been a privilege having you on today. And to all our viewers, thank you for tuning in. Remember to like, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Before I wrap up, Yomi, is there any social media handle that people can follow you on if you want to share, so that they can follow you, hear some of your thoughts, if they want to get involved, or they are looking to, because you mentioned it in the opening statement about helping people that need to understand more about the African story, their identity, and how they can get involved. So what would that be?
Well, so I'm active on Instagram and Twitter. So on Instagram, it's at Black Empowered. And then
Black Empowered.
at Black Empowered. And then on Twitter, it's, I actually forget that from time to time. It's The Conscious Mind.
Okay. So at Black Empowered, for which one, sorry?
Instagram.
Okay.
And for X, I think that's what it's called right now. It's The Conscious Mind.
The Conscious Mind. Okay. Absolutely. So I'm just putting that on the ticker below so you can reach him at Black Empowered on IG, and on X, you can follow him on The Conscious Mind. Thank you so much, Yomi, for joining us today, and I'll see you in the next one.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure.
You're welcome.